What is up, YouTube? It's your girl Evelyn, and today I will be recapping Season 1 of Gentleman Jack. So sit back, enjoy the video, and as always, I will be spoiling the entire season, so proceed with caution. It's Halifax, it's 1832, and Ann Lister is back.
You can't tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man.
The Listers are one of the oldest and oddest families in Halifax. The head of the Lister household is Anne, aka the Gentleman Jack of Gentleman Jack. Anne is a brilliant, highly cultured woman who knows a lot about a lot. Anne spends most of her time traveling, hobnobbing with high society, and falling in love with women who either can't or won't commit to her. Because, well, it's the 1800s.
I am not gay.
Anne's most recent heartbreak comes courtesy of her former lady friend Vera Hobart, who has decided that it's time for her to get married to a man.
I thought you were out.
I decided against it.
Donald asked me to marry him. I shan't say no.
So poor, heartbroken Anne has returned to Shibden Hall, her ancestral home, to nurse her wounds and reconnect with her family.
You're ridiculous. You're so selfish.
Quite possibly. Now I need to talk to Aunt Anne.
Will you, in future, think about others whilst you live in here?
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
There's her sister Marion, who low-key/high-key resents Anne because their uncle left his entire estate to Anne, and only Anne.
Bruh.
Then there's Jeremy, their father, who loves and accepts Anne, even if he doesn't always agree with her. And last but not least is Anne's aunt, Aunt Anne, who's more like a mother to Anne than an aunt. In fact, it's Aunt Anne who suggests her niece might consider paying a social visit to Anne Walker, a shy, nervous, and filthy rich young woman who seems a bit odd, if you know what I mean.
Gay!
But Anne tells her aunt she doesn't have time for such frivolities because she's busy. Right before Anne's arrival, there was a carriage accident involving one of the Lister's tenants, the Hardcastles. The accident was caused by an unidentified man driving his carriage recklessly, and as a result of the accident, little Henry Hardcastle had to have his leg amputated.
And I took that personally.
And because investigating an accident that barely concerns her wasn't enough of a distraction from her broken heart, Anne decides it's high time she entered the coal game.
10 bands, 50 bands. 100 bands, fuck it, man.
To understand the main plot of Gentleman Jack, you need to know a little about coal mining in the 1800s. I know, I'm sorry, but not to worry. I promise this won't turn into a video essay about the history of coal extraction. Probably. As everyone knows, coal is what children get for Christmas when they're bad, but it can also be used for things like heat and fuel and yada yada yada. Coal was, and arguably still is, a pretty big business, and in the 1800s, if you had lots of coal, you could make lots of money selling it. And it just so happens the land surrounding Shibden Hall is overflowing with coal, but the Shibden coal has just been sitting there, collecting dust for 40 years, because, well, the Listers don't really need the money. They're on their passive income hustle and live off their tenants' rents and labor. Not to mention, before you can sell your coal, you first have to mine it, aka send men, women, and small children down into the ground to get it. And even before that, you have to first sink a pit, which I think just means dig a big hole in the ground. The point is, all of that stuff is super expensive and time consuming, which is why nobody's been doing it. Well, that's not entirely true. Someone's been doing it, just not the Listers. The Rawson brothers, Christopher and Jeremiah, or as I like to call them, Goofus and Gallant, are also in the coal game and have secretly been sneaking into the Listers' coal beds and stealing their coal. Naturally, when Anne gets wind of the alleged theft, she's livid, but unless she actually catches the Rawsons red-handed with her coal, there's nothing she can do. Or is there?
What I really want to see is the
Anne can prove the Rawsons are stealing her coal if she leases out her coal beds, which is apparently a thing you can do. Basically, a miner would agree to pay Anne a certain amount of money for her coal. Anne would then allow that miner to go into her coal beds and grab however much coal he wanted. The miner would then pay Anne for the coal he took, which he would then turn around and sell for a profit. But because the Rawsons are stealing Anne's coal, she knows their theft will be discovered by whoever she rents her coal beds out to. Which means if the Rawsons want to keep from being found out and, going to jail, they need to lease Anne's coal beds themselves. And because Anne wants to be paid for the coal they already stole, she can just overcharge them a lot.
I understand you're leasing out your coal, and if that is the case, my brother and I would like to ask you how much you'd take for it.
£226, 17 shillings and sixpence.
That's ridiculous.
It isn't.
In the midst of Anne's coal war, her ex-girlfriend pops in for a quick visit. Not that ex-girlfriend, this one, Mariana Lawton, the first woman who broke Anne's heart by marrying a man. Throughout the years, Mariana and Anne have remained friends.
You got a friend in me.
Mariana thinks Anne should just get a beard, like her. But Anne insists she will only marry for love. And as we all know, Anne Lister only loves the fairer sex. Speaking of which, remember Miss Anne Walker, the nervous, incredibly rich young woman who's a bit on the odd side? Diagnosed with a condition of the nerves at a young age, Anne has been on her own for quite some time. Both of her parents died unexpectedly, as did her brother, and the only immediate family she has left is her sister Elizabeth. But Elizabeth lives in Scotland with her asshole-ish husband and many, many children. So the mentally fragile Anne was left to be watched over by a tribe of unscrupulous relatives, many of whom have their eye on her inherited fortune. Now, Anne's cousins, the well-to-do Priestleys, aren't actually after her money, but they do like to insinuate themselves into Anne's life. And it just so happens the Priestleys find the mannish Anne Lister to be quite charming and amusing, if not a little unusual. So they decide to pay Anne Lister a visit, and of course, they bring their little cousin along.
I've heard so much about you lately. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
Despite having told her aunt she wasn't interested in pursuing a friendship with the young Miss Walker, Anne has a sudden change of heart after the meeting. Maybe she was swayed by Miss Walker's beauty, or maybe it was her charm, or maybe it's because Miss Walker seems like someone who could be easily manipulated, persuaded, to do whatever Anne wanted her to do.
Shall I stay here and endeavour to make wealthy little Miss Walker my wife?
I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of Gentleman Jack's weird little side stories. They're fine, but not overly interesting. Like Anne's French lady maid Eugenie, who's hiding an out-of-wedlock pregnancy and is forced to begrudgingly accept a marriage proposal from this guy, John, who agrees to pass the baby off as his own because he's a widower and wants a mother for his kids. Unfortunately, Eugenie miscarries, then immediately dumps John because
I was just kidding. Come on.
There's also a slightly more interesting side story about young Thomas Sowden, one of Anne's tenants who murders his abusive father and feeds him to some pigs. Good for him. Thomas then goes on to marry Susanna Washington, a bright young woman who's slightly above his station. Again, good for him. Then there's Anne's sister Marion. She starts dating this guy for a little while, but he ends up engaged to another woman, and that's it. Like I said, the side stories were fine, and they do provide a much-needed break from the show's main storylines, which are coal and lesbians. Now, back to coal and lesbians. Anne and the Rawson brothers are still negotiating a potential coal lease, but Anne tells them there's an anonymous party who's also interested in leasing her coal, so they might want to jump on it while they can. Christopher, aka Goofus, thinks Anne is bluffing, which she kind of is, but also kind of isn't. There's this whole other storyline involving this man named Hinklecliffe and...
It's this whole crazy thing.
Goofus still refuses to pay Anne's ridiculously high price, but Jeremiah thinks maybe they should. After all, they have been stealing her coal for God knows how long. But Goofus is an absolute asshole, and he knows if Anne can't find someone to lease her coal, the only way to prove they stole it is if Anne were to sink her own pit, aka dig a really deep hole in the ground and go down there herself, which she can't afford to do. Not to mention, everyone in Halifax knows how much Anne loves to travel, and there's a good chance she'll get tired of the coal game and be off once again. So they decide to wait her out. Meanwhile, Anne is still investigating the carriage crash and speaks to one of the grooms involved. The groom is certain he saw Christopher Rawson driving the runaway carriage, but he's too afraid to testify because the Rawson brothers, especially Goofus, wield a lot of power in Halifax. But despite her dogged determination to beat the Rawsons at their own game, Anne is equally committed to... She's even begun renovating parts of Shipton Hall, just in case a certain wealthy young woman decides to move in. And most of Anne's free time is now being spent at Crow Nest, aka Miss Walker's place. After several warm chats and a few strolls together, Anne can feel Miss Walker growing attached to her. But attachment is an attraction, and Miss Walker seems more confused than anything, while Anne seems more calculating than captivated. I get it. Anne just wants a woman for a wife, and any woman will do. Well, any rich woman will do.
I see I must be uncommonly and fastidiously delicate in leading her into my own ways, but I believe I shall succeed with her.
I'm not saying Anne is a bad person.
No. Well, yes.
It doesn't take long before things start heating up. In fact, Anne has a private hut built in the woods for...
Welcome to my sex room.
And even though they don't actually have sex there yet, they do share their first kiss. Not long after their first kiss, Anne attempts to have their first, something else. But Miss Walker is afraid to go further. She says it's because she's inexperienced and doesn't want to disappoint Anne, but it seems like it might be something else. It's something else. Somehow, the nosy Priestleys hear about Anne's frequent visits to their little cousin, which makes them feel some type of way. Sure, they might find Anne Lister charming and some of her antics amusing, but it's different when it's family.
No.
Eliza Priestley makes it her mission to catch Anne and Anne in the act, and she does. But her cousin doesn't care, because Anne Walker is officially in love with Anne Lister.
You got a friend in me.
Back up on my bullshit, back up on the scene.
Meanwhile, the coal negotiations have come to a standstill, with neither Anne nor Christopher willing to capitulate, which makes Anne seriously consider sinking her own pit, which you'll remember means digging a really big hole, more or less. Technically, Anne could afford to sink her own pit, but it would take every penny to her name, and possibly a loan as well. So if anything went wrong, Anne could be forced to sell off Shibden to repay her debt, unless a certain rich young heiress had a few dollars to spare. Unfortunately, a certain rich young heiress just received some bad news. Mrs. Ainsworth, a dear friend of hers, was recently killed in a carriage accident. The news sends Miss Walker into a spiral of depression, so her friend, Harriet Parkhill, comes to stay with her while she grieves. But it soon comes to light that Anne's depression has less to do with Mrs. Ainsworth's death and more to do with Mrs. Ainsworth's husband, the Reverend Ainsworth. So, back in the day, Anne used to spend a lot of time hanging out with the Ainsworths, and the randy Reverend developed a crush on her. And even though Anne wanted absolutely nothing to do with him, the Reverend wouldn't take no for an answer, and he forced himself on her. Unsurprisingly, now that his wife is dead, the Reverend Ainsworth has once again set his sights on Anne and sends her a letter threatening to expose their affair and ruin her reputation if she doesn't agree to marry him. Of course, when Anne Lister finds out, she does what Anne Lister does best.
Miss Walker has been very explicit about what went before the letter. I hope you would appreciate the propriety and necessity of abstaining from any further communication with her. Otherwise, you will be exposed, Mr. Ainsworth, as an adulterer.
Remember Harriet, Anne's grieving buddy? When Harriet first arrived to Crow Nest, she was absolutely taken in by the Anne Lister charm. But thanks to those meddling Priestleys, Harriet has learned of Anne Lister's unnatural ways and begins treating Anne with thinly veiled contempt. Not to mention, thanks to Eliza Priestley's big mouth, everyone in Halifax now knows about the two Annes. It's enough to push the already fragile Miss Walker over the edge. And she dumps Anne.
I can't do this anymore. It's wrong.
No, it's perfect.
Yes, it is. It's wrong. It's repugnant. It's against God. It's queer.
Meanwhile, the Rawsons are fuming over rumors that Anne Walker might finance Anne Lister's pit sinking. And in case I didn't mention it before, the Rawson brothers are actually related to Anne Walker. They're her cousins. Then again, so is like half of the town. And try as they might, the Rawsons don't have much of an influence over their little cousin anyway. And if Anne Walker financing the pit sinking wasn't bad enough, apparently Anne Lister's been telling everyone in Halifax that Goofus was seen driving the carriage that caused the accident. Needless to say, Christopher is pissed and ready to teach Anne a lesson. After being dumped by her future wife, then beaten up by the Rawsons' thug, Anne's had enough, and she's ready to get the hell out of Halifax. She puts the pit sinking on hold and readies herself for a trip abroad. But before she can leave, she receives a message from Crow Nest. Anne Walker isn't doing so well. When Anne arrives at Crow Nest, the troubled Miss Walker apologizes for dumping her and begs her forgiveness. But it's clear Miss Walker is unwell. She's hearing voices that are threatening to kill her, and she's in near constant panic all the time. Anne stays with her for several nights, but it's obvious Miss Walker needs medical help. While Anne's taking care of her lady, Goofus is finding even more inventive ways to bully Anne about her coal, like having his men destroy an access road that's on her land. But at the moment, coal is the last thing on Anne's mind. She writes a letter to Miss Walker's sister, Elizabeth, about the seriousness of her condition, and not long after, Elizabeth's asshole-ish husband, Captain Sutherland, arrives in Halifax to collect poor Anne and bring her to Scotland, where she can be taken care of by family and treated by doctors. Miss Walker doesn't want to go to Scotland because she's afraid if she does, she'll lose Anne forever. So Anne decides it's the perfect time to propose.
Will you accept it?
That's rough, buddy.
After Miss Walker leaves for Scotland, Anne ties up a few loose ends before her own travels. And by loose ends, I mean coal. She sets up a meeting with Christopher, and the gloves finally come off. Anne outright accuses him of not only stealing her coal, but also hiring a thug to beat her up and causing the carriage accident. Goofus, of course, denies everything. And despite wanting to be done with the coal business, Anne is not done with the coal business. She takes out a loan to sink her own pit and puts the deed to Shibden up as collateral. After leaving her right-hand man George in charge of the pit sinking, Anne sets off.
On the road again. Just can't wait to
Anne's first stop is London, where she meets up with her favorite ex, Mariana, who inquires about the wealthy little Miss Walker. Anne admits that, despite her best intentions, she's somehow fallen for Miss Walker, and even proposed, which makes Mariana feel some type of way. And the two of them bicker the entire time Anne's in London. And because hanging out with one ex-girlfriend isn't enough drama, Anne decides to pay a visit to Veer. The two chat amicably, and Anne even holds Veer's newborn baby. It seems Anne's heart has finally moved on. After spending a little more time in London and ignoring Mariana, Anne sets off once again. Meanwhile, in Scotland, it's become apparent that Captain Sutherland doesn't have Anne's best interest in mind. Instead of seeking medical treatment for her, the captains decided to marry her off to his debt-ridden nephew. Thankfully, Elizabeth is on Anne's side, but the situation becomes too much to bear, and a despondent Anne attempts to take her own life. Meanwhile, Anne has just arrived in Denmark and is having the time of her life. She's hanging out with royalty, literally, and getting low-key hit on by a 20-year-old French countess. Anne is finally and fully in her element, and life is good. But back home, things aren't quite as good. The pit sinking is going terribly, and the crew needs more money to finish. Not to mention, poor Aunt Anne has developed an infection on her leg and is getting sicker by the day. At least in Scotland, things have gotten better. Anne has survived, and with her sister's help, she writes to the Priestleys, letting them know that Captain Sutherland is holding her hostage until she agrees to marry his broke-ass nephew. The Priestleys spring into action and go rescue their cousin. In Denmark, Anne receives a letter from her sister Marion, basically telling her their aunt is dying. So Anne cuts her trip short and rushes home, only to find her aunt on the mend. But now that she's back in Halifax, Anne is forced to deal with the pit sinking situation, and she's stuck. She just doesn't have the money to finish sinking the pit on her own. Good thing Miss Walker's back in town.
Anne, if you asked me to marry you again, I wouldn't say no.
Not long after, the two Annes exchange rings and quietly take the sacrament together, symbolizing and legitimizing their marriage before God. That is it for the recap. As always, thank you so much for watching, especially if you've made it this far, because you made it through the coal.